Thank you, and hello again. Now we're getting to our roundtable discussion, and the three participants of this discussion are friends from the GA Society. There is no moderator for this roundtable, so I ask the participants of this roundtable to introduce themselves shortly. So please, we are opening the 1 hour of roundtable is yours. All right, just started.
Okay, so it's me and Adam and Marina. And so this roundtable just evolved out of an email discussion we had a few months ago in response to one of Eric's chronicles. And we got so interested in it, we thought, well, maybe we could share some of these ideas. But so we agreed that Adam would begin because he seems to have the most radical suggestion to make. And then Marina was going to come up with her own idea in response to Adam. And then if I have anything to say, I might jump in. But the point is to involve everybody. So I think these the panelists are going to speak rather briefly. But Adam, you're up then. Oh, you need to turn your mic on.
Oh, sorry. Right. I thought I had done that. Yeah. So the question is this concept of Eric's the internal scene of representation, which we mostly traced back to Originary Thinking, which is a '93 book of Eric's. Maybe we found passages before that. That seemed to be the bulk of the passages. We ended up going on a kind of search for all the different times. We couldn't really go through all the chronicles, but it started with again, kind of I don't know, provocative claim of mine that the internal scene of representation does not emerge on the Originary scene. Okay, that what we think about as an internal scene, a kind of interiorized consciousness, is a product of very different developments. So what I did, I actually typed up some theses that I think I just read because I would just read because we all agreed to just start with about 5 minutes or so. I tried to I should have realized I've tried this before. I tried to copy and paste them into the chat box. And that didn't work, but they're short enough so that I'll just read them. And I think that will be my 5 minutes, more or less. So first, the first thing that I want to say is this is not something we could prove one way or another. In other words, there's no way you can kind of prove that that there is an internal scene of representation or that there isn't in the Originary event. Which is true, by the way, of a lot of things, which goes back to this question of intuition that Eric spoke about. It's more a question of what a particular vocabulary can do. And that won't be evident until different vocabularies have been used and tried out. Okay, so if we kind of eliminate talking about the internal scene of representation, how would we have to talk about the things that we talk about using that term? Second, I want to suggest that a basic principle of GA should be extreme caution regarding anachronisms, which I mean, we can't avoid them because we're always talking about what happened before people were actually speaking, and we can only do that in speech. But at any rate, categories, we should try and reduce that to a minimum and have a kind of, sort of rigor about how we do that. And categories with a history of which we're aware, it becomes a problem to say they're just there on the Originary scene. We might be able to say there are preconditions of them on the Originary scene. But with regard to an internal scene of representation, the kind of internal scene that we would see represented, if we do see represented in, say, the Iliad, is going to be something very different than what we see in a 19th century novel. And I think it's very helpful to be aware of these kinds of distinctions and not collapse it all into one kind of either consciousness or internal scene or whatever we want to call it. One thing that I noticed in sort of getting questioned and pressured by Marina and Richard, and going back and looking at all of these ways in which Eric uses the term, is that the purpose, it seems to me, that the internal scene serves for Eric is to preserve a space of what we could call a kind of pre or not quite social freedom over and against the social, which is to say, it seems to me to be a kind of precursor of romanticism in the way in which Eric has studied that. And it seems to me the alternative to that is to speak about freedom within and with the social, right? Instead of something that needs to be defined against it. Next, everything human, I want to say, is a relation between margin and center. And what seems to be coming from the inside is really coming from the outside, in the sense of coming from the center. And so part of my kind of program, theoretical program, is to take vocabulary out of kind of internal scenes, interiority, and shift it, externalize it as much as possible into actual scenes, right? Which always involve some kind of shared center. Now, the strongest argument for an internal scene to be coeval with the originary event seems to be, and this I owe to Ian, who's pointed this out to me a couple of times, and I hope I'm presenting his argument accurately. It seems to me to involve the assumption of an imaginary possession, or the imaginary possession of the central object on the part of each member of the group, that's produced by the oscillation between intensified desire and the prohibition on approaching the object. But this imagined possession, it seems to me, is a possession either against the group and against the center alike, or it's a possession that's imagined to be granted by the center. Now, in the former case, I think we have then a kind of what would seem to be an anachronistic romanticism, right? That you possess something against the center. In the latter case, we have a particularized relation to the scene, not a new separate scene. So in the latter case, which is to say your imaginary possession of the object is granted by the center. You imagine it being granted by the center. In that case, we can understand the resentment towards the center that's presumably bound up with this imaginary position, not as a resistance to the center, but as a continual attempt to solicit, master, and refine the words and gestures that will answer to the prescriptions of the center. Right? So again, it's always a relation to the center. It's not something kind of sets you separate from and to some extent at least opposed to the center. Okay, so that really was 5 minutes. So Marina and Richard, I'll leave it to you to follow up on that, and then anybody else, I guess.
Yes, okay, so mine is longer, it's closer to 10 minutes, and I will have to read my points. So I have 3 points. I hope I'm engaging. I think I'm engaging with Adam's second point. I have 3 points, but the overall point that I'm trying to make is that paradox cannot be thought outside of the oscillation between the internal and the external scene. It's constitutively an oscillation between the two. So point 1, the internal scene is already part of the external scene. We cannot abstract it. Why? I'll first say that one reason GA's new way of thinking is because it connects the inner to the outer, thus bridging the Cartesian gap. It starts with the conflicting impulse in the pre-human, the wish to appropriate an appetitive object and the fear of repercussions, which forms an internal state. And this internal double bind predicament is resolved by the emergence of a new adaptation, language, which is an external formal structure that is shaped and understood by all members of the newly formed human community. The internal and external are brought together on the scene of representation, a novel GA concept that captures the performative nature of human interaction and eventfulness of human experience. The scene can be identified, to quote Eric Gans, as the oscillating attention of the peripheral participants between the reciprocal exchange sign and its sacred central referent. So it's important to point out that while the reciprocal exchange of signs is a collective enterprise, the focus on the appetitive object is private. So even though, you know, Adam was talking about the center, but the focus itself is a private thing, while joint attention placed on this sign can be ascertained empirically. The attention placed on the sacred central referent is an imaginary act on the internal scene. There can be no collective act of fantasizing about an appetitive object. Another original insight of GA is that the world of imagination is connected to the external world via the fulcrum of paradox. The paradox is expressed by the contradictory logic of, and I'm quoting here, the signs reproducing the abortion of the gesture's original aim to possess the object, and thus desire is thematized by the enunciation of the sign expressing desire, whose formal precondition is the desire's deferral. The paradox thus cannot be encoded by logical relations, and it introduces the phenomenological categories of energy and the forces of attraction to and repulsion from the center that act on the peripheral participants. The relationship between the center and periphery is that of tension. The tension formed between the periphery and the center upholds the differentiation between them. As Gans says, the circulation of psychic energy between the original appetitive drive and the deferred scene of representation is the source of human creativity. The interior scene is also the source of conflict. Again, Gans says, whereas the mimetic element of the sign operates by affecting a common agreement as to its meaning, the mimetic element of desire contains a constant threat of conflict. Signs may be indefinitely multiplied, whereas objects of desire are unique. And so this is, now I'm coming to the main point of the first point. So if we thus discount the mimetic element of individual desire in our analysis of social human behavior and choose to see it through a cooperative lens, we will risk missing the paradoxical element that is responsible for conflict and innovation and central to sociality. For example, people who study patterns of consumer behavior and advertisement strategies are well aware that consumers are driven by conflicting feelings captured in the famous adage of, I don't want to belong to any club that will accept me as a member. Another example might come from asking the question of how scapegoating is possible. I don't have my own theory, but I suspect that paradoxical and contradictory forces are at play here. People want to align with others in a cooperative way, but at the same time compete against each other by striving to occupy a culturally central position, but in reality expelling someone else into the shaming center. Second point, without the internal scene, we cannot deal with the aesthetic aspect of existence, which is central to being human. The aesthetic moment consists in the frisson of the oscillation experienced on the internal scene, that between the form of the art object and the imaginary reality it represents. I will use the example of rhetoric as a subset of the aesthetic. Rhetorical theory not only draws helpful discriminations between different rhetorical situations. It also identifies cognitive, affective, ethical, and aesthetic responses that texts seek to elicit in order to produce desired effects. Rhetoric is relevant not only to the private experience of aesthetic appreciation, but to the social objectives of influencing public opinion through speeches, for example. These nuanced discriminations and effects that rhetorical theory isolates can help us see how our responses are shaped and layered by complex rhetorical strategies. But rhetoric cannot provide us with an explanation of why these strategies work and how to make them more effective. But GA's theory of the scene can, by making us aware that our social instinct compels us to consolidate the scene by prolonging our experience of it. And we do it by supplementing the sign in more and more elaborate ways. At the bottom of all rhetorical effects lies the prolongation and supplementation of the sign along competing and interacting dimensions of aesthetic experience. To describe what is going on in each passage of a literary text or political speech, we need to put ourselves on the internal scene and evaluate the forces that act upon us. For example, the affective response might express our anticipation of closeness or distance from the center. The ethical response might reflect our complicated relationship to the authorial position, and so on. Finally, the rhetorical approach on its own cannot illuminate the paradoxical aspects of aesthetic experience. One famous example of paradox is the conundrum of reading. We desire both to come to the end and to delay the ending so as to prolong our reading experience. And now to my third point, is the shortest, which has to do with our reluctance to delve into our inner experience because we think it's too messy, complex, nebulous, and undifferentiated. With something that shifts under our feet as we strive to pin it down, perhaps it is better to leave it alone altogether and concentrate on the external and verifiable. This perception is no longer accurate, however. In the last decade, cognitive theory has made great strides in breaking down the cognitive process into constitutive parts and articulating helpful conceptual taxonomies. Thus, distinct quote-unquote seats of agency were identified, such as the attentional agency versus the cognitive agency. A greater understanding of autonomy, intentionality, and control mechanisms was achieved, as well as the loss of autonomy, loss of control and self-awareness. Some of these models are compatible with the way GA describes the experience on the internal scene. So there is no reason to shy away from modeling interiority. But just as rhetorical theory tends to stay descriptive rather than explanatory, cognitive theory risks not straying too far from folk psychology as long as it doesn't engage with a larger explanatory picture. I am done. Thank you.
Richard,
okay, great. Yeah, I probably won't even take 5 minutes. So yeah, to go back to Adam's point about sort of tracing the phrase, the internal scene of representation, I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty sure that it dates to originary thinking, not the concept, but the phrase. Because I looked at the End of Culture, and especially a section on desire uses a similar phrase, but Eric calls it the imagination or the imaginary scene. Right. And I think that I mean, I don't know if I can share my screen, but I sort of collated some of these quotes. This might be worth reading. Let's see. Yeah. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Thumbs up. Yeah, so I've got these two quotes from page 26 of The End of Culture, which I'm just going to read. You can read along with me. For the duration of the scene of representation, the object is not really wanted, but desired, precisely insofar as it has become, for this duration, inaccessible. The scene of representation is real, but it is also reproduced in the mind of each participant as the origin of what we may call his desiring imagination. And I mean, the whole page is relevant, but then skipping a few lines to the second quote from the same page, I like this one. The solitude of the object admits of no real possession, but by the same token permits each member of the group to prolong his gesture in an imaginary possession. But in order for this imaginary possession to take place, each must take into himself, this is a phrase I like, secretly as it were, the collective scene of representation. So, Eric talks about the imaginary scene here in order to, I think, expand on his idea of desire. And the key point he makes is that desire is constituted by this temporal relationship to the central appetitive object, so that desire is distinguished from appetite by the fact that the object is not merely perceived, but imagined. And the only place where the object can be imagined is internally within the individual imagination. So the internal scene is, another word for the individual imagination. And of course, Eric also makes it clear in this section of End of Culture that the internal scene is dependent, and Marina said this already, and so did Adam, but it's dependent upon the collective scene in which the individual is holistically, as it were, participating. So you can only imagine possessing the object because the real one is forbidden. And that, there's he talks about this being kind of an obvious point, but one that's never considered by theoreticians of desire. But it's a version of paradox. It's the origin of the pragmatic paradox that leads then to logical paradoxes, which you can only have an imaginary possession. So, I mean, in our original email discussion, I'm, always taken by some of the objections that Adam makes, and one thing that one lesson actually I took from Adam's, demand that we try and think of, more rigorously about the internal scene in the Originary hypothesis. So we do have to be careful with the vocabulary, and I think there is a risk that we project onto the scene later historical manifestations of the, of what we like the internal scene to be, and I think that's at one point we talked about, Verbitska's primal concepts. What can we use that? What other term could we use? I seem to remember we came up with perhaps the word perspective. That in order to participate in this joint scene, you have to have a perspective on it, and perspectives will differ. I can't remember exactly how we developed from that, but I think at this point I'd just like to ask Adam and Marina if they would like to add another statement or two, or that we can open it up. It's totally up to you guys.
Well, I'd like to try something to maybe give, because maybe people were asking why I'm even asking about this, why I see this as a problem, and so on. So I want to give a sense of how I'm thinking about it, and why I think this is worth questioning and examining a bit more closely. Now, I forwarded this essay to the GA list about I don't know, maybe a couple of months ago. It was Marshall Salin's last essay, and it was about what was it called, primitive politics or something like that. And
The original political society, I think.
The original political society. Okay, thank you. And he made an argument there, which he actually that essay is in a book that he wrote called On Kings. He co-wrote with the anthropologist David Graeber, and this is a point they actually make in quite a few places throughout the book. And the argument he makes there, and I posted that in the context of the originary egalitarianism, which we were just talking about, which Eric came back to in his talk, and the point that he makes is that if you really listen to the members of these communities very closely, maybe there's a kind of egalitarianism among the humans in the community, but there's a very, very systematic, stratification of the most extreme kind in the relationship between those people and those who they actually think govern them, which is to say the supernatural beings that govern them. And they do see it as being governed. And if you look at it from that angle, then we have to at the very least qualify very significantly the egalitarianism of this originary scene. And he even makes the point that, yeah, we could say that they're kind of projecting onto these supernatural kind of, political leaders, basically. They're just projecting onto them their own resentments and their own kind of conflicts and so on. But he also says that, the kind of system of laws and prohibitions and means of kind of adjudicating conflicts and so on gets so complex that it's a world of its own. It's not just you can't kind of do a sort of one-to-one correspondence between what's going on in the community and what's going on in their relation to again their rulers. And again, that's exactly these are the ones who gave them the law. These are the ones who enforced the law, and so on. And so it seems to me that I can kind of agree, I think, with just about everything that Marina said, except every time that there's a reference to someone doing something internally, if we replace that with something like, this figure on the center is telling me this now, or I'm acting on instructions from this one from the center, or I'm having my attention drawn to something by so-and-so from, who's on this kind of central scene, that's more real than the human scene at that point. I think that if we substitute everything, every time that we would use, something going on internally with some figure at the center telling us something, ordering us to do something, directing our attention to something, whispering something in our ear that we repeat, we could talk about all kinds of ways of articulating it. I think that we could have an equally rich description. And I think, it would be in some ways a better description, because it would be a description that that situates our analysis much more richly and deeply in the history of all the thoughts that we have and all the desires that we have and all the forms of paying attention that we have and so on. If they're all modeled on actual figures that we're repeating, that we're imitating, that we're practicing being like, we're rehearsing the lines they give us, again, however you want to talk about it, it seems to me we have a redescription of all of these things. And in my view, we don't lose anything. This would be as consistent with the originary scene as it's possible to be. And again, it would open up things instead of, something coming from me, I'm thinking something. Well, anything that you're thinking, we all know this in a sense, right? That anything you're thinking, it's a revision or a translation or an extrapolation, or it's an extension of something that you've heard or that you've seen, that you've read or whatever, right? How else would you come up with anything in your own mind? So why not just directly, see things in those terms? And the last thing that I'll say is, I agree, and this is a point that I made as well when we were talking about it. I agree that of course we have an experience of interiority, right? I mean, we talk to ourselves. We kind of have, we might have internal scenes as we're constituted now, but again, that's a historical product, right? And I think it's a historical product in particular of literacy, right? I think with illiterate people who read and read silently and take in the words that we kind of say to ourselves silently as we're reading, that's really the internal scene. And if you look at people who don't read, who don't, communities without writing, or at least that kind of writing, without alphabetic writing that records speech, then, I think if you're looking for an internal scene, you're going to find very different and much more kind of complicated kinds of evidence for that. And if you really want to insist on the notion of an internal scene, I think that you might have to kind of cut a lot of corners and squeeze things in to that conception that don't necessarily fit. So, okay, I can open it up to anybody else now.
Yeah, does anyone want to jump in? Go ahead.
Ian.
You guys have thought about this a lot more than I have, and so on. But the one thing that strikes me about the way you're describing it, Adam, is that I've always assumed that the things you're talking about are simply later. That's not what happens on the originary scene. That it's much simpler on the originary scene. The center is not giving instructions or anything with sort of narrative or any other kind of content on the originary scene. It's just saying stop, to my mind, in that aesthetic moment that's part of the originary scene, the community, the others who created it in the first place, kind of drop away, or they drop out of consciousness. And that oscillation that Marina is reminding us of is between imagined appropriation and inviolability. Whether the subject on the originary scene who's having this kind of experience is able to attribute that to anything in any logical way to the community around them, it seems to me doubtful. It's just, but that's what it's kind of reduced to. In other words, I take everything you're saying, but isn't that later? Those sorts of things. Is that clear?
Well,
enough?
yeah, that's okay. Good. That's kind of that's the spirit in which I'm making my own argument to kind of really pare away everything that we can't really reduce to the originary scene, and so I push things back very early, right, to the originary political community. But you're pointing out, yes, there's something that comes before that. But if all of that can't be attributed to the originary scene itself, then I think we have a problem with anything like an internal scene being attributed to that as well. But I have a different response, which is you're right. The center is not saying anything but something like stop, okay? But in that case, even that's kind of a bit of an anachronism, right? But we're getting as close as we can to eliminating them, right? We can't get much closer to that. So I completely accept that description, right? But if it's saying stop, then that means that if there were to be an internal scene, that internal scene would be everyone saying stop to themselves, and that's coming from the center. So and even if we say it's stop and go, right? What's going on inside of each person is kind of stop and go, and we got to kind of balance from that. The go is nothing more than, but also nothing less than a response to the center. In other words, it's a dialogue with the center, and it might be a dialogue with everybody else on the scene as well. But let's keep it to the center. So if we have kind of a stop-go dialogue with the center, why do we need an internal scene to, let's say, deposit the go part of it, right? Why isn't the go, and the go part of it for that matter might be something more like okay when, right? But even that is going to be a kind of dialogue with the center. And again, it's not really so different than taking words from someone else and kind of repeating them, restating them, right? The go is pretty much the opposite of the stop that you're hearing. So it's still, the word is coming from the center and you're repeating it with a different, say, inflection. So I don't know, is there something in what you were saying that I'm not addressing there, Ian?
I could let someone else come in on this. I'm sure all of us got some ideas here. Maybe Andrew next. Yeah, well, I just, is it stop or go? I mean, it's, I guess, you know, I'm prioritizing, as I think the theory does, the aesthetic moment in the process. It's only an imaginary go, in a sense, you know, but moments before the originary scene happened, people were going to eat that thing, right? They're going to try and so forth. And once they've stopped, then they are doing that in that part of the oscillation. I mean, the oscillation seems to me the central effect that one's talking about. It's not a pair of different commands. It's one command and an imaginary compensation for it. That's how I've understood it anyway.
Okay, I mean, but it's you know, yeah, right. This is actually one of the theses that I cut out, the reference to aesthetics. So I'll kind of make the point here, and then we'll hear from Andrew. The aesthetics, again, it seems to me it's kind of a full-bodied sort of immersive experience in the scene. You're oscillating along with and as part of everyone else. It's not, I don't think it's your own kind of, their own kind of internal, kind of separate, private oscillation. You're oscillating, you're seeing everybody else do the same thing. Everybody else is representing you back to yourself, like everyone else. It's that, what's the term that Fish used in his talk, ambivalating or something like that. Right, that's what's going on in that originary aesthetic experience. But anyway, Andrew, what were you going to say?
Well, it's probably, here we are, the 10 people in the world who find it fun to think about this. So it's nice to be together. But I just wondered if it would help to be literal about, imagining what goes on. And, one of the things that has to go on for the originary event to take is it has to be remembered. The animal bodies that disperse after the consumption of the food object have to, it has to ratchet up. So each individual body that leaves the event where the food object is consumed has to have some kind of memory. And then you can add to that, I mean, we're thinking about the internal scene of representation, but one thing that is very important to me about the originary hypothesis is that at the very origin of the human, we have artifactual representation, which is external to the human. And my context here is all the cognitive scientists who use the word representation to refer to something in the brain, neuronal firings, and some kind of repetition in the brain of an experience that gets remembered, stored, becomes information. But GA is more primitive than that, in that the gesture is a physical thing, and it's an external thing in the sense that, and this is where Tallis comes in with the hand. This is why I found Tallis's book about the hand so exciting, and thought, there's a real overlap here. Here's a guy who's not really interested in the origin of language, but interested in the origin of consciousness, and he sees the origin of consciousness in each individual human body's awareness of the hand as something external to the mind, in a way, and yet it's part of the body, right? He has these little exercises about placing your hand on your body to become aware of it. The hand is something external to the self, and for him, that's what makes humans different from there. So my point would be that yes, it's the internal scene of representation, but what's carried away in memory is the gesture and the memory of the gesture. And the gesture is something in a way that's external to the self, in the sense that you're remembering the gesture as something that refers to the food object, refers to the event, refers to the other animals that were at the event, but that is also your own. Your own hand is, your hand is your own. It doesn't belong to anybody else. And the memory of your own making of the gesture has to be your own, all of that. So I don't know. I don't know if that helps or not, but it's a way of not worrying so much about internal seeing and just linking the experience to individual bodies. And I had another thing to say about what's at stake here. And I think actually there's a lot at stake in terms of the difference between the originary hypothesis and what's called mimetic theory and, the gradualism of Girard, where there is really no model of individual consciousness at the origin of the human in Girard. There really isn't, and I think that's one of the big differences between GA, that all humans have, some minimal consciousness that each their own at the originary event. Whereas for Girardians, it's where the hell is it? It's collective, and it's some kind of mechanism that nobody's really aware of. But for GA, yeah, we are aware of it. We're aware of this gesture. We carry the memory of the gesture with us when we leave the scene and when we come back. And that until that is happening, until that temporal gap between one event and the next is, filled by the memories, which are at once shared, but also individual. And we're just thinking here of the individual brains, again, of the individual proto-human animals. We don't really have the originary event, I don't think. And this would be something separate from any description of what happens the very, very first time, because it has to happen more than once. It has to happen once, but it also has to happen more than once. And I think I'll just stop there.
Well, I'll just say, I think I agree with all of that. The memory of the gesture is in the repeating of the gesture. And you can repeat the gesture because you've done it and because others have done it. And because the gesture is tied up to, to an event that the more you do it, the more you could see kind of, in a sense, the preliminaries of the event and so on. So yeah, I mean, what you said in the middle there, so we don't have to worry too much about the internal scene is maybe is maybe the most important point of all of that. I mean, if we're going to talk about how things get remembered, yeah, they get remembered in these material ways through things like rituals, which is kind of a collective social memory, and we have all kinds of things like that, well, okay, I mean that's enough.
Is it possible that we're arguing about it? It's a vocabulary issue, really. That in a sense, as long as we rephrase it in the way Andrew did, that you have to have an experience of it that then you, as it were, attached to the collective scene. That's a less loaded way, if you like, to talk about the internal scene. Well, I'd like to actually hear Eric, why did you use the word internal scene?
You think I should say something at this point? I'm interested in hearing how people are, in a sense, practicing originary phenomenology here. I mean, I try to be as simple as possible, but I find that Adam's attitude toward the scene is almost, I don't want to say fetishistic, but it's as though there's always just one scene. Well, what happens when I'm alone in a room and I imagine something? Why do I have to say that that's the original, that's the scene? Obviously, I'm able to create these scenes in my head because at some point in the past, humans created the notion of the scene so that each person has his own private scene, and that's already true in the beginning. That's why humans create things. They invent things because, as I, talk about the primitive men, or primitive humans, excuse me, you can go, once one has the sense of a collective scene in which I've participated, then individuals can go off on their own and start, planning things, which is not something that animals do regularly, even if they, may make a few gestures toward, knocking a box off the top of a shelf or something. But, because you have a sense of significance. In other words, here I am, I'm trying to solve some problem, like how to make this stone tool or whatever. But I see it in the context of my community, not, immediately. I don't imagine a bunch of guys standing around watching me, but I have the sense that this is significant. And don't forget that the sacred and the significant are basically the same. In other words, I have a sense that I can contribute something significant by, solving this problem. And this leads to human inventivity. In other words, well, and to put it in other terms, the whole notion of the pour soi, of the surgir, of human consciousness and so on, is based on the idea that each person has this private scene in which they see things not as instinctively, but with the néant that separates them from it so they can contemplate it. And this means that each person has his own conscience, which is, by the way, a term I didn't use, but I could have when talking about the sacred. I mean, in the sense, what is the conscience? It's the, it isn't the big daddy who is kind of looking at me. That's which is Freud's idea. It's God who's looking at me, or if you like, it's the same thing in the sense of the sacred I was talking about. So it seems to me that very difficult to avoid having an individual sense of the whole point of being a human is that precisely you have this sense. Animals do to some extent, but basically the animal model is more like an anthill. I mean, once you get past the anthill, you're moving toward the human, but only the humans get to the point where each individual has a conscience. Animals don't have a conscience. You can't imagine that the wolf who just ate the sheep is feeling, it was kind of horrible, that poor sheep. They don't think that way. They don't have a sense of this being inhabited by the sacred, if you like. So that's why it seems very natural to consider the individual as having his own individual identity. And Girard talks about the interdividual. I think he goes too far in trying to make us all basically participants in this emissary murder. He never gets back, that's not really the message of Christianity, it seems to me, that individuals do have conscience. And it's something that doesn't, the Girardians have never really been able to deal with, and that's why they can't understand why mimesis is both good and bad and so on. I'm not sure if I can ever get to them. I will be speaking at cover this year, but anyway. So that's where I find that Adam is sort of trying to think of the originary scene, but I mean, the scenic is something that humans have the ability to conjure up in all kinds of ways. And that's why I think it's very natural to talk about the individual scene, the scenicity that one can apply to everything. And that I think it makes it's an interesting question of how animals see the world, but humans in a way are always seeing a scene more or less. And then there's a question of scenicity. Like if I'm just looking out the window, it's hard to say that that's a scene, because there's no question of real significance, but people do look at landscapes and make a big fuss about them. And so the point is you can always sort of scenify things. When you say, Adam, when you say the center, there's a different, you could even talk about the centrality of things. If I just look out the window, there's no real center, but if I want to really focus on something, like if I'm reading a book or if I'm doing a chemical experiment, then I realize that this is significant. This is something that can lead to something that the human race can benefit from if I get this right, that kind of thing. I think I'll stop now, but so that's the basic idea of the individual scene representation.
Well, I mean, I can say something to that, but maybe other people have something that they want to add or ask as well.
Marina's got her hand up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, right. Kind of looks like got a halo around it, Marina.
Yeah,
So.
that was really clever of you.
No, it's the light, so I could.
Little angelic hand there.
No, so it's the oscillation thing. To me, it's one of those paradoxical things, you know, and I am on board with the idea of the center, you know, telling us to do things. I have experienced things like that as well. And also in othering, like our hand, I don't know if I'm maybe mixing things up in like Macbeth, what he's talking to the knife. I think he's talking to his hand as well, or you know, but at the same time, so this oscillation is a little bit schizophrenic. There's this other agency, but there is our agency, what we perceive as myself, that is like thinking at the same time. So it's not that the center says stop, go, but the center might be saying stop, but I'm at the same time, you know, even though I have this, you know, like imaginary agency of the other or of the center saying things to me, but I at the same time want to go and get it to spite the center, you know. So you know, oscillation has to do to me with this too, and it's also part of this paradox that I inhabit two conflicting, contradictory positions on my imaginary scene, you know, that as a, you know, as for people, you know, pre-literacy, what they thought, yeah, I don't know, it's a provocative thought that they didn't think in terms of self. Maybe it's just like my imagination doesn't reach that far, but that's what I wanted to say, that oscillation is this kind of paradoxical idea that is difficult to deal with, I think.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so again, I'm not critical of the notion of oscillation. I think that I haven't said anything about, and well, except insofar as it doesn't seem to me to be necessarily something that happens in some interior. For me, I mean, you this idea of being on two scenes at the same time. Well, I mean, look, I'm here. There's you know what, like 20 people in front of me here, and if I look over at Richard and he's kind of looking at me in one way, maybe in an encouraging way, and I'm looking over then at Andrew and he's looking at me in a more kind of quizzical, skeptical way. Not to say that you are, it's all just examples. That I mean, then I'm on two different scenes, right? I'm on this one scene and I'm on these two different scenes and I'm oscillating between the two, right? I'm looking at one person who's saying, yeah, go on, you're making sense, keep going, we're listening. I'm looking at someone else who's maybe saying, wait, hold up a second, you know, that's not so clear. And I'm kind of oscillating back and forth between the two. And maybe there's a third and a fourth, and there's more oscillating going on. Now, again, we're all, like I say, we're all kind of modern literate people. We all do have something that we can call internal scenes, but I don't see any problem with talking about that kind of oscillation all the way back on the originary scene in terms of someone on the originary scene seeing two different other members of the scene. It could even be just one member of the scene who's kind of, you know, himself, two people seeing themselves oscillating would kind of see their own oscillation in the other, right? And so you could describe a very rich scene in which there's oscillation without talking about, you know, without needing, again, to kind of deposit it in some internal scene somewhere else. And so, yeah, I mean, in a sense, there always is. I mean, it's not just the originary scene, but there are always actual scenes that we're a part of. And if we're talking about, you know, yes, you go off by yourself, although going off by yourself and thinking something through and kind of planning something and getting your own idea, again, I'm not so sure how far back we can trace that to. It's not obvious to me that the earliest human beings were doing things like that, right? We're doing things like that. And it's also not at all clear to me that the earliest human beings would have had something that we would recognize as a conscience. I think, the earliest form of right or wrong could hardly be anything other than just getting the ritual right? If you got the ritual wrong, if you messed up the ritual scene, then you're expelled more or less severely and permanently from the group. And if you get it right, then you're part of the group. That seems to me would have to be the earliest form of something, of what we call conscience, but that's not what we mean by conscience, right? That's just the earliest form of being in the group or out of the group. And that, anything that we're going to call a conscience has to, ultimately has to come from that. And so, you're in relation to a scene and you're planning something. And as Eric was saying, you think it's going to be significant. It will add something. Well, add something to what? Well, Eric said to the human, to the human race or to your community or whatever it might be. Well, that means that you're kind of on the margins of some scene and something you're kind of taking in various voices, various commands, various suggestions, what this human scene needs. And that's what gets factored into your thinking, well, this might be a good idea. I'll work on this and so on. So all of that is you really incorporating yourself into that scene. And again, there are thousands of scenes, millions of scenes going on. This is one scene right here. We're all on other scenes in relation to whatever, our governments, our families, and so on. So all of that's going on, but we're always on one of them or several of them at the same time. And we could describe those relations to all these different scenes without having to stop and say, well, there's some other place inside of me where all this is really going on, or there's something else going on. Again, it just seems to me you don't need something like that. Your relationship to all of these scenes, what you contribute, what you take from them, that's enough to make you an individual.
Can I make just one more point? Okay. I think one of the problems is that the term scene is ambiguous. And on the one hand, the scene is just the place that things happen on. And on the other, the scene or the scenes that take place in that scene. My idea of the individual scene or personal scene of representation, it's the stage on which things happen within your mind and so on that you can create. And just as the public scene is the scene where things happen in public, and that's really the distinction. The scenes that take place on the scene, that's a different level. I'm talking about the fact that the possibility of scenicity comes from the fact of having a scene, like a stage. So maybe that would make it easier. We each have stages in our heads, if you want, or mental stages on which we stage things. And there's also a public type of stage, like some ritual situation. And so that's the difference between the individual and the public scenes. But in both cases, the scene is not what happens. The scene is the locus. And well, I think I should stop, but I think that maybe we should make it clear that there is a difference. The word scene has this ambiguity about it.
Marina?
Yes. Oscillation is not one thing happening after another, because then it would not be paradoxical. Then it's just a sequence, even not things happening, not this and back and forth, but it's something special. And what is the special thing? I think it's something that creates a differentiation. So this scene we have in our head, this stage or whatever, there is a separation, there is a differentiation. Like, we are not on the scene, we are not on the stage. There is a barrier, we could say. What is this barrier? And I think this barrier, oscillation is this paradoxical something that creates this force field, that it's something that happens at the same time that cannot be resolved, and creates this, I know that this is not clearly, explained, but, I think also, understanding oscillation is relevant to this experience of something is on the stage, and the stage is different, and it's differentiated by a barrier that we cannot cross.
I think we're out of time, actually. One thing that I'll say is, I mean, I guess the simplest thing I would say is to take, I think I could take my, the example that I used, which you picked up on one after another. I mean, ultimately, if I'm looking at one person on the scene and then another person on the scene, when I'm looking at one, the other is kind of there in my looking, right? That my looking at any one of them is framing the way I'm looking at another one. So it is simultaneous in that way as well. But, you know, also I just want to kind of suggest and kind of look forward, one thing that really will be helpful in talking about this is Roman's concept of alternativeness, which is what my paper is gonna be on Wednesday. And I think that what Marina is talking about, that kind of oscillation, I mean, I think Roman, really adds a new concept to GA. That's what I'm going to try and kind of prove or show on Wednesday that will help us to talk about all these things. But otherwise, I guess we have another session, right, coming up, and so I mean, anyone have any last minute thoughts? It's not something I expected to be resolved, in this hour. So.
All right. Many thanks to Marina, Adam, and Richard for this amazing roundtable they arranged for us. And thank you to all of you. And we have a short break before the last session for today. All right.